Thanks for listening to the Archbridge podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wilterdink, and today I'm joined by our president and CEO, Gonzalo Schwarz, to talk with Dr. Scott Winship. Scott is a resident scholar and the director of poverty studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he researches social mobility and the causes and effects of poverty. Before joining AEI, Scott served as the executive director of the Joint Economic Committee, where he created the Social Capital Project, a multi-year research project to investigate the evolving nature of social relationships, including families, communities, workplaces, and religious congregations. Scott has also been a visiting fellow at the Foundation for Research for Equal Opportunity, where he remains an honorary member of the Board of Advisors, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Public Policy Research, a fellow in the economics department of the Brookings Institution, the research manager for the Economic Mobility Project at the Pew Charitable Trusts, and I should also mention Scott has several papers that he's written for the Archbridge Institute on economic mobility as well. So, Scott, thank you for joining us.
Oh, pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Just to kind of get us started here, you are the director of poverty studies, so if you would, I'd love for you to just give us kind of a big picture view on poverty. I know you've worked on it for a while and social mobility as well. So is there maybe like 3 or 4 sort of top trends that jump out to you as things we should know about poverty and social mobility in general?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I think the way that I tend to think about poverty and mobility is a very positive story on the one hand and a not so great story on the other. So I think on poverty trends, we've actually made a lot more progress reducing poverty than is generally recognized. Even according to the official poverty statistics, which have all sorts of problems that, depending on how deeply into the weeds we want to go, we can talk about those. But the official statistics indicated that before the pandemic, child poverty was at an all-time low. Poverty was at an all-time low. There have been numbers that have come out since from the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University that suggest that even as of January or February of this year, poverty was at an all-time low. And those numbers actually understate the progress that we've made for a variety of reasons. But the best poverty numbers suggest that since the early 1980s, poverty among kids has been on the decline. Poverty among the kids of single mothers is at an all-time low. Poverty among African-American children is an all-time low. So it's a pretty unambiguously good story there. The problem is that when you turn to social mobility, the rate at which poor kids escape poverty as adults hasn't improved at all over 50 years. And what does that mean? Well, it could very well be that one of the reasons that poverty has declined is because we've expanded the safety net. That's not the only reason, but it is one reason. But it's possible that the safety net, at the same time that it reduces point-in-time poverty, it actually has these perverse incentives that cause people to make choices that inhibit upward mobility. And so while we can reduce point-in-time poverty, we're not getting anywhere reducing multi-generational poverty, for instance. So that's kind of and you can sort of go much deeper on either poverty or mobility, depending on where we want to take the conversation.
Yeah, the thing that jumps out to me, I had heard something about if you measure based on consumption, right? Like the consumption measure of poverty. Can you talk a little bit about that research that's come out and whether you think that is a better way to approach it than the more traditional method of measuring poverty? Yeah,
so a lot of the decisions around measuring poverty come down to pretty technical methodological choices that researchers make. And in the past, for a long time, the income numbers had enough flaws that some researchers, most prominent of whom would be Bruce Meyer and James Sullivan, have instead turned to consumption data. So consumption is basically what you spend rather than what you receive as income. So in theory, they ought to be similar. People get income, they can either spend it or they can save it. So it wouldn't necessarily give you the same information, but if they give you very different information, you'd be concerned about that. The consumption data comes from a government survey called the Consumer expenditure survey, and it has tended to show in the past even bigger declines in poverty than a lot of the income based analyses have done. I think we have a better appreciation now that if you look at income the best way possible, which means taking into account taxes and tax credits, because taxes have declined over time and the generosity of tax credits has increased over time. If you include things like non-cash benefits, food stamps, housing subsidies, school lunches and breakfasts, those sorts of things, if you include health insurance that you might get from the government or from employers, you tend to basically get the same results whether you use income measures or consumption measures. I have a chart in a paper that I wrote in 2016 that actually shows the Meyer-Sullivan consumption trend against the income-based trend that I measure, and they basically lie on top of each other. So, but both look much better than if you just use the official poverty rate. And so I think researchers are pretty clear at this point that we use the official poverty rate for a variety of public programs. It's written into statute that's how people qualify for certain things. But if you really want to know how people are doing and how that's changed over time, it's not the best thing to look at.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, we're kind of learning a bit more about how to get a better and more accurate picture. So I'm glad to see that that's becoming a bit more widely adopted. Well, kind of turning to the mobility stuff then, I know for the Archbridge Institute, you put out a couple different installments of this primer. In the first installment, you looked at sort of the snapshot of economic mobility in the United States using the panel study and income dynamics research. If I recall right, the things that jumped out to me most on that were that it was still something around on the lines of like 3 and 4 kids were doing better off in terms of income than their parents at the same age. And that was actually, in terms of absolute mobility, even for the bottom quintile, the poorest were still actually doing better. Do I have that right, or am I missing something sort of in there?
Yeah, that's right. So maybe just as some background for the listeners, when we talk about mobility, we can talk about absolute mobility or relative mobility. Absolute mobility is, are you better off than your parents were after you take into account the fact that the cost of living has gone up? So you can start out poor, say in the bottom fifth, and you can end in the bottom fifth. But you might still be better off than your parents. If everybody sort of gets richer over time, that would still be absolute mobility. Relative mobility is if you start in the bottom fifth, are you able to escape the bottom fifth? So you can have absolute mobility, but not very much relative mobility. And so in the paper, I tried to develop the best estimates I could for both of those. You're talking about the absolute mobility estimates. That's exactly right. I wanted to try to look at the research by Raj Chetty at Harvard, who had gotten a lot of attention from some results suggesting that only about 50% of adults end up better off than their parents at the same age. And that was lower than some previous studies. I worked at Pew, as you mentioned, a ways back, and we had put out some estimates that were higher than that. And so I used this other data set to try to look at it that way and to improve on some of the choices that they made using a measure of inflation that more accurately reflects changes in the cost of living, taking into account changes in family size and things like that. And at the end of the day, I concluded that, yeah, it's more like 75% of Americans who end up better off than their parents. And as you said, I think in my paper, I don't think I actually reported this. I could be wrong. I think I ran into sample size issues, but it's previously been found that you're much more likely to end up better off than your parents if you grew up poor. And that makes sense. If you're the child of millionaires, the chances that you're going to also be a millionaire or make even more are lower than if you grow up in poverty. And then to be richer than your parents, that only means you have to make, $15,000 or something like that. But yeah, upwards of 90% of poor kids end up better off than their parents at the same age.
That was really good news, when I read that, and it was kind of a stark contrast from. I remember the headlines that came out with that pretty seminal Raj Chetty study that was, the American dream is dead, or at least it's on life support, or something like that. And you've pushed back on that a little bit. Now, I know, Gonzalo, you've written a lot on the American dream, so feel free to jump in here when we're kind of thinking about some of the differences between some of these papers. I don't think, to my knowledge, you weren't calling out any sort of issue with the way that they had put together their study. It was just more of sort of what they're measuring and sort of how you're taking away from that. So I guess this question just boils down to, in general, do you think the American dream is dead? Do you think it's on life support? Do you think how worried about it should we be in general?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overblown pessimism about the American dream. I think Raj Chetty is a fantastic researcher for sure. But I do think his analyses overstate the extent to which absolute mobility has fallen, which it probably has fallen over time. And also it just puts too much emphasis on the importance of absolute mobility, frankly. So what do I mean by that? Well, so first of all, we've already said that poor kids have more absolute mobility than rich kids. That doesn't mean that any of us would prefer growing up poor, so that we can then have better odds of absolute mobility, right? Nobody would choose that. Similarly, Chinese kids today probably are going to have much stronger absolute upward mobility than American kids, because China is a much poorer country than the United States. Again, which would you choose? You don't sort of prioritize absolute mobility above everything else. And then the last thing I would say, this decline in absolute mobility for kids who were born in 1940, the Chetty research shows that over 90% of them ended up better off than their parents. So, would you prefer to have been born during the Great Depression, but knowing that you were almost definitely going to be better off than your parents, or would you prefer to be born, in the 21st century when your odds of being better off than your parents are lower? So it really is. It's not fair to sort of equate the American dream with ending up better off than your parents are. Living standards, have improved greatly over the years, and that's got to count for a whole lot too. And then there's this issue of relative mobility, where the trend story is not as positive, as I mentioned before. And if I had to pick something to worry about, it would not be declining absolute mobility. It would be the fact that we haven't made any progress on relative mobility.
Yes, and I think in that sense, Scott, just building on that, and I think you were saying about living standards, is that usually the American dream is discussed, like the most typical definition is a land where people seek to live better, richer, and fuller lives. So the component of if we're better than our parents, it's always maybe just the richer part, but are we living better lives, as you said? Living standards are better or fuller lives if people have more opportunities to pursue different careers that are not depending exclusively on income, but it's more fulfilling in that sense. And I don't have any data on any trends of people searching for more fulfillment in lower paying jobs than their parents, but just in general, I think that it's a more holistic idea. And I don't know if you agree that sort of the discussion, the more maybe academic or policy discussion of treating it like that as just a number, if we out earn our parents, is not given so that big picture. And in terms of surveys of the American dream that you have done at the AEI, or even we have done, people associate American dream more with just the freedom of doing what you want, or family life, or other aspects.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We did a survey, I think it was similar to one that you guys did way back when I was at Pew, where we asked people, how do you define the American dream? And, all of us in the wonkosphere or whatever, talk about economic mobility or whatever, but you're absolutely right. Far and away, the most popular choice is something like the freedom to do and say what I want. So it's really kind of the American dream is sort of libertarian in a lot of ways, which makes sense. If you think of the history of the country and kind of the nature of sort of American politics. So yeah, and whether that has changed over time is totally different from the question of whether absolute mobility has increased over time. The other area where I think there is, I think this pretty widespread sense among a lot of people that that something has gone wrong. There's this malaise, this sense that that things are in trouble. And there, I think what's happening is that a lot of our social life, and we can talk about social capital later on, perhaps, but a lot of aspects of our social life really have deteriorated over time. Everything from the stability of families to the amount of time we spend with our neighbors and our coworkers off the job, to the number of groups we belong to, and the congregations that we attend. Faith in institutions, things like that, and so by that measure, perhaps if that's part of the American dream, maybe things are sort of fraying. But I think the problem is people misattribute the sense that something has gone wrong to economics, and they think, oh, the economy has failed us and created these problems, whereas reality is just we've all made choices as Americans to pursue more stuff and to buy more things and to be more individualistic, and we've lost things on the way as a consequence of that, and we're not necessarily willing to kind of face up to those trade-offs. But that's getting off topic a little bit, I guess.
That's definitely very interesting. One thing I wanted to sort of talk about before we move on to social capital or some of these other trends is that it's also, I think, in the public narrative, there's a perception that sort of a narrative that ties income inequality a lot to social mobility, and they're intertwined as if it were the same terms. And there's a lot of disagreements, and you're reading about it as well, about if inequality is rising as much as the public discourse wants us to believe or to see, and there's issues with measurement and all that. But just in the sense of how those terms are still very intertwined and entangled when there shouldn't be, and the policies to, I think, fix either of those issues are different, and where our policy conversations sort of think that sort of point to that we need to fix inequality in order to solve income mobility. So I don't know if you can talk just a little bit about that, sort of that income inequality narrative that sort of pushes into that, if it should be intertwined or not, or anything around that.
Sure. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. They're two different things. You can imagine a world in which there was a lot of inequality between, say, lawyers and security guards, but where the sons of lawyers and the sons of security guards, had equal opportunity to become a lawyer or a security guard or whatever else. If we lived in that world, probably inequality would bother people a lot less. You can also imagine a world where we leveled incomes so that there was no income inequality. But, if you were born to the poorest educated parents, you would end up, among the poorest educated yourself. And maybe there would be no income inequality, but sort of inequality of opportunity in a sense, would still be quite large in the sense that you wouldn't be able to become a lawyer if you wanted to, if you were the son or daughter of a security guard. So they really are two different things. And, theoretically they could be linked, but it's an empirical question, of course. And so I've spent a lot of time pushing back against the idea that when you have more income inequality, you get less intergenerational mobility. I think most famously, the Obama administration had a chart that was that became called the Great Gatsby curve. And essentially it just showed that countries that had more inequality had less mobility. And it was just a scatter plot, it was kind of plotting countries on a X and Y axis, which of course, A, it's just a correlation. It's not causation at all. B, the measure of mobility that they used something called the intergenerational elasticity, which actually looks worse. Looks like you have less mobility when inequality is growing. So it's almost the relationship between the two is almost baked in. And so in my second paper for Archbridge, which was comparing mobility rates across countries, I showed that that sometimes the U.S. Looks much more similar to other countries if you use a relative mobility measure rather than the one that was used in the Great Gatsby curve. For instance, if you're comparing male earnings, sons and fathers' earnings, or daughters' earnings to their father's earnings, the U.S. doesn't look much worse than other countries at all in terms of mobility. If you're comparing family incomes, the story is a little different. The U.S. does look like it has less mobility than other countries, but these kind of decisions really matter. And so, getting back to the point of inequality and mobility being related, when I've dived into the evidence, there just hasn't been very strong data one way or another that makes the case that you get less mobility when you have more inequality. In particular, the trends don't match up, right? If mobility hasn't increased over time, it certainly hasn't fallen much over time either. Even though, in theory, income inequality has skyrocketed, which we can come back to. That it's not actually even totally clear that that's the case. But if inequality has risen and mobility, has been flat, that's not consistent with the idea that it should have worsened mobility over time.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, I'd point people to Gonzalo's paper looking at some of the structural factors that might be affecting both mobility and inequality. I mean, like you said, we don't really know exactly, but I could easily think of a case it's extreme, but let's say Venezuela, right? I bet you'd find a lot of inequality there, and you probably would find a lot lower mobility, but I don't know that there's a direct connection. There's obviously other policies that are probably affecting both of those things at the same time. And so, again, an extreme example, but that it doesn't seem out of the question to me that there might be policy decisions that are playing with both of those variables. I do want to kind of move on to the. Sorry, you want to finish up on any thought there?
Oh no, I was just gonna agree with you that one of the problems with linking the two is that it really matters why a country is a high inequality country. If it's a high inequality country because it's authoritarian and there are elites who are skimming off of everybody else, you can imagine that would affect people's incentives, and you might very well get less mobility and less economic growth if it's a country that has a lot of inequality because it allows for outsized returns to people who innovate and take risks. Then that could actually be a way of motivating people to try to aspire to bigger and better things. So it's really to just kind of link the two is really a very simplistic statement to make.
I am intrigued by this idea that people are sort of conflating sort of some of our social bonds and sort of this sense that there's something kind of going wrong. I mean, at least from my perspective, you've seen that from the left. You kind of have a Bernie Sanders approach, who's it's the millionaires and the billionaires who are causing all of these terrible things. And I for a while I think the right was less prone to that, but in my opinion, since, I don't know, 2015, 2016, there's really been a sharp turn on that. I'd be curious to hear if you guys have a different opinion, but at least from my perspective, it looks like, okay, now the right has sort of joined this bandwagon of there's some elite out there of some kind that's sort of pulling these strings in a way that's making your life tangibly worse. And so, they have different villains. We have, the right has a little more different boogeymen here than the left, although not always. I don't know. It seems to me that there are relatively few voices out there who are now kind of willing to push back on that a little bit. So is that something that you guys have observed as well? Do you think I'm sort of off base there, or how do you look at that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, for a long time, it sort of seemed like, the left didn't like economic elites, and the right, obviously painting with very broad brush, the right didn't like cultural elites. And I think that's basically true still, but increasingly you do kind of have this group of national conservatives, where maybe American Compass is sort of the best example of that increasingly are railing against economic elites as well. I recently wrote something for the Dispatch that was criticizing an American Compass report about inequality. I think it's really interesting the way that American Compass has evolved on this. Orrin Cass and I debated a few years ago about, how workers were doing and how men were doing. And eventually we kind of got to a point where I think I had persuaded him on a lot of the numbers that I was citing showed that even, male earnings aren't lower than they were before. They haven't increased by a ton. And his response was, well, but they should have increased more. And it was really an argument about inequality. And at the time I sort of said, look, if the issue is inequality, you should just say that it's inequality. And now, last month or the month before, they put out a report that was very explicitly, saying inequality levels were too high and the increase was too high, and that had all these consequences. And it felt like I was, back in 2014, fighting with Thomas Piketty about inequality. So things really have pretty much all the arguments that I was dealing with versus the left at the time, I'm now seeing come up on the right as well.
Yeah, I wonder if you can maybe shed a little light too on. I know a lot of people are very concerned about inequality, and maybe you could tell from the conversation so far. I'm less concerned about it. I think the reason why you have inequality matters a lot. Authoritarianism versus you just have a really dynamic economy that rewards innovators, and you're not going to punish that. And so I think I'm less concerned about inequality as in and of itself. And I think for people who are very concerned about that, couldn't they just say okay, well, we'll just have 100% estate tax then, and you can maybe that wouldn't solve all of inequality, but you'd probably take a real big whack at it. So if inequality is the problem, why don't we see more proposals like that? Or maybe we do, and you're more attuned to that than I am.
Well, some of the policies that are being proposed, are quite radical, even if they don't necessarily sound like it. The idea of a wealth tax, for instance, levied year after year would pretty quickly, wipe inequality not completely out, but it would have a pretty dramatic effect. You can think of a wealth tax, a fairly small percentage wealth tax as being equivalent to a tax of over 100% on capital income. It's sort of the same way of thinking about it, and essentially that would happen year after year with a wealth tax, and that would have pretty dramatic effects on the economy and on innovation. Probably on inequality as well, but I think you would get the sort of circumstances that the right worries about when they hear people talking about reducing inequality. You would when you reduce inequality, there are going to be some consequences too, and among those, reduced economic growth might be an important one. Over the last 40 years. The only time that income concentration has gone down on a consistent basis has been during recessions. Recessions, are not good for the middle class or for the poor. The periods where inequality goes up tend to be the periods where middle class incomes are rising and when poverty is falling. So I think some of the wealth tax proposals, are not 100% estate tax. proposals, but they would have pretty profound impacts. And fortunately, they don't seem to be going anywhere at this point, but they certainly have some prominent backers.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm glad you're able to kind of clarify that a little bit. I guess it really comes down to sort of like what people perceive as the actual root of the problem, and sort of how you want to address that. Getting back to some of the mobility stuff, we could have. I remember you were giving a talk one time, and somebody asked you, should we aim for perfect relative mobility, right? So have like all of the income quintiles, completely shuffle, like 20% at each one. It's basically, a roll of a 5-sided die every time you're going to do something. And I remember you were saying, it's a little more complicated than that because, do you really want to live in the world where, no matter what you do for your kids, it doesn't matter? There's no. So can you talk about that a little bit of like some of the struggle with even where should we set our sights in terms of a policy goal when it comes to mobility, or is it really more just an observational tool?
Yeah, it's a really tough question. I mean, I tend to feel like it's not quite as clear cut as with poverty, where I think our goal ought to always be less poverty than what we've got. Of course, like how you get there matters a lot. Upward mobility is a little bit more complicated, where I don't think you can say, well, we just whatever we have, I think we should have more upward mobility. But I do think we should have more upward mobility than what we currently have. I used to tell people, we should be at least as good as Canada. And in the years after I started saying that to people, some research has come out that I go over in part 2 of the primer that I wrote for you all. It looks like, again, if you're looking at men's earnings, it looks like we are actually as good as Canada in terms of relative mobility. We are as good as Sweden, even in terms of relative mobility. We may even be as good as Denmark, according to Jim Heckman's research. So when you find out something like that, and you've gone on the record saying, well, we should be at least as good as Canada, and now maybe it turns out we are as good as Canada. That's kind of sobering. But I do think even if we are as good as Canada, maybe I'm moving the goalposts at this point. We ought to be shooting for more. Perfect statistical mobility would mean, if you're born in the bottom, you have a 20% chance of staying there, and you have a 20% chance of making it to the top fifth. Currently, those numbers are more like 40 to 45% chance of being stuck in the bottom, and more like 5 to 10 making it to the top fifth. I think we can do better than that. I don't know what the right number is, and again, a lot would depend on how you did it. If you just redistributed money at the end, you could achieve perfect statistical mobility, but I don't think anybody would be happy with that result. Ultimately, what you want is more poor kids to have the opportunity to become whatever it is that they want. The point about a world with perfect statistical mobility, I think Reihan Salam is the person that I heard say this. This point that that's a world in which no matter what you do to help your kids, it's all for nothing, right? Because ultimately, it's just going to be a coin flip where you end up. That's not an appealing world put that way. The way that I would sort of put it is, imagine if we had a world of true equal opportunity, where everybody was pushing their kids to succeed in whatever the kids' goals were. That would be a world in which a lot more people were working hard. A lot more people were having stronger educational attainment, innovating more, taking more risks, and in such a world, you might end up where it was a coin flip at the end, but we'd all be better off for it, because essentially it would create more competition in a sense. You can imagine that there are some people that are born in the top fifth who are not that incentivized necessarily to do better than their own parents. A world where they had a bigger risk of ending up not at the top wouldn't necessarily be a worse world in my view. That would be a world where we'd have stronger productivity growth, stronger economic growth. So it's a really complicated question, and I think anybody that tells you they sort of know what the right level of mobility is, probably hasn't really thought about what they're saying.
So despite our matching Canada and some of the Nordic countries, maybe Gonzalo and I will hold off getting a big mission accomplished banner for you. But soon. Well, we touched on it a little bit earlier, but I kind of want to go back to the social capital discussion. So I'm going to kind of lob a real big one at you here, Scott. But so maybe you can start by defining it, sort of, so if people don't really know what it means, at least not in a technical sense, we might have a sense of what it means. One book that's really jumped out to me in the past maybe couple of years has been Tim Carney's Alienated America, where he kind of goes into some of these questions about, we have the sense that something's wrong, and he kind of tracks it by counties, and he looks at the social capital in those counties, and he sort of relates it to some of the, the Trump voter stuff, looking particularly at counties that, either voted for Trump in the primary or versus counties that ended up voting for Trump in the general but didn't vote for him in the primary and were a little more resistant. And he talks about how maybe social capital is kind of a dividing line between some of those. So I'm going to kind of hand it over to you to just talk a little bit about social capital, what it is. Maybe if you want to run through some of the findings for the Social Capital Project, and if you can keep it all in your mind, I'd love to hear what you have to say about Tim Carney's book and what you think he gets right or maybe what you think he gets wrong.
Sure, yeah. Let's see. So first of all, social capital is one of those terms that everybody sort of thinks they know what it means, but it turns out people are often using it to mean slightly different things. That's true even among researchers, by the way. The way that we talked about it in the Social Capital Project when I worked for Senator Lee was, just think of the two words that are in social capital, like capital is something that is valuable to people because it is productive. It helps them achieve their ends. So financial capital, savings lets you do things because you've got money. Physical capital, produces widgets or, whatever it is that a business is producing, which gives them a flow of money. Human capital, we all have, those are the skills that are valuable to employers that generate income for us. And so social capital is capital. It's productive. It helps us achieve our goals, whatever those goals are. We can think of goals that that everybody approves of, and we can think of goals that we would think are abhorrent or whatever. But to each individual, capital is something that helps them achieve their goals. And social, just means it's capital that is imbued in relationships. So social capital is really just the valuable part of our relationships with other people, just by virtue of knowing people, of being connected to institutions that people have gotten together to form in order to achieve ends. Those are all those relationships are forms of social capital. So in the Social Capital Project, I like to think of it as in two phases, and phase 2 is ongoing, by the way. This is an ongoing project that I'm no longer affiliated with. Phase 1 was mostly just descriptive stuff. So we wanted to show what had happened to indicators of social capital over time. Turns out the answer there is that they've pretty much all deteriorated. And then we also wanted to look at how social capital varied across different parts of the country. And the story there is basically that southern states and counties from California all the way to South Carolina tend to look the worst on most indicators of social capital. And places like the Mountain West and the Dakotas and Minnesota and Wisconsin and northern New England tended to rank the highest on social capital. And that was true for a variety of different measures related to families, related to communities, related to philanthropic giving, related to violent crime. They all tended to kind of cluster together with each other across these states that way. And then phase 2 of the project was intended more to try to propose some policies that could shore up social capital, or that could expand opportunity by targeting social capital as a way of expanding opportunity. And so phase 2 has proposed everything from school reforms to promote local schools that are more in line with community values and preferences, to affordability things like making it easier for younger families to afford to buy a home so they can start families. We had a report that came out a few months ago. They had a report a few months ago on police reforms as a way of restoring trust in law enforcement institutions. And so that's really been the goal of the project, to try to articulate what the issues are around social capital, and to think about what can policy do to improve social capital. And then I guess the last part of your question was about Tim Carney's book, Alienated America, which I thought was great. It was probably my favorite book that came out that year. That probably was 2 years ago at this point, maybe 3. But would really recommend it to all your listeners.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the description for this too, so people can find it.
Yeah, Tim is just really a great writer, and he's good at explaining, fairly complicated social science and economics ideas, and good at exploring, this explanation for, where the Trump phenomenon kind of came from. And, he argues that communities that are rich in social capital, whether they are affluent or not, they can be affluent like Montgomery County in Maryland, or they can be lower income, such as in Iowa or the Dakotas. But if they're rich in social capital, they tended not to support Trump at very high levels. And so his argument is that when you're not sort of embedded in communities that offer support, you then turn to what's on offer from opportunistic politicians. I'm not sure that Tim would put it quite like that, but that would sort of be my interpretation of what he finds. But it's a very, very good book. Yeah,
I really enjoyed it as well. I think there's a lot there, and hopefully we'll get Tim on here sometime to talk through it a little bit more too. But one of the things that you said was phase 2 of the social capital project was sort of proposing some of these different ways that you could use policy levers to influence social capital. And I'll admit, whenever I see the reports come out, I read them. I think they're really valuable. I'd like to see those reforms adopted. But at the same time, I'll have to admit, I'm a little skeptical that even any policy lever could really budge some of these things that much, in the sense that, you can't write a law telling someone to be a better spouse, or you couldn't really feasibly write a law that says, people must volunteer, in their local community, defined by like census tracts, or, there's so many of the things that go into social capital seem to me to be a bit beyond the reach of public policy. So can you comment on that? Do you think I'm maybe overly pessimistic there, or what do you think the limits of social capital are there?
Yeah, I think policies can only sort of have impacts at the margins. As you say, so much of this is stuff you can't legislate. And in particular, so many of the problems that we have around fraying social life are the result of choices that we've made, that I alluded to earlier. We could have chosen, for instance, to remain at the living standards that we had in the 1960s, for instance, and to continue to have families supported by one breadwinner, typically was a guy, and have another parent at home. Typically, that was the mom. in such a world, there were more opportunities for community building, because rather than working 80 hours a week, families were working 40 hours a week, and then and investing the rest of the time in social capital. As more and more women joined the workforce, we could have, as a society, the men could have said, like, wow, this is great. Now I only have to work 20 hours and I can invest 20 hours in my community and my family. But that didn't happen. Instead, we now, have more two-worker families, which is fine. I have a daughter. I want her to have all the opportunities in the world, but we have to recognize that these were choices that we made along the way. So part of what we were trying to do, I think, in the Social Capital Project, was just draw attention to this fact that, that in some ways, like, we've just got to face up to the choices that we've made. And if we think we chose badly, or that we went too far in one direction, then let's take a look at ourselves and think about making some more changes. The limitations of policy, I think you can see most clearly when you think about the increase in single parenthood, which of course has been a very big policy issue. Policymakers have spent a lot of time trying to reverse that trend, but pretty much without much success. George Bush, when he was president, the second George Bush, funded marriage promotion and fatherhood programs that were rigorously evaluated and didn't actually move the needle on increasing marriage. And we just don't know of any other ways that have been that effective. It's possible that some of the safety net reforms that we pursued in the 90s stopped some worsening trends from continuing to worsen. Things like teen pregnancy, out of wedlock births. But even there, the evidence is not super strong. So that's an example of a social capital breakdown that has long been recognized as an issue and that policymakers have wanted to reverse. But, we don't really know how. The limited things that we've tried haven't really worked. So that's all kind of in support of your gut sort of view on that, I think, Ben.
Yeah, well, I was hoping that you could provide me with some more evidence for optimism, but I guess it's better we have a clearer picture of what's happening. So I think about some of these things. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about that you kind of hit on a little bit here was how, we've definitely shifted what our workforce looks like. We've shifted a lot of what our family dynamics look like, since the 1960s or so. In my reading, some of the, I guess you might call it like a new nationalism or, however you want to kind of refer to that, is I read some of it at least as kind of a backlash to some of those trends. And I think you're kind of hitting on maybe one of the main points of disagreement between, how you see things, or how some of the, I would call them like the Reformicons, might have seen things in the past decade, and sort of how this new nationalist approach is coming. My reading of it is they're witnessing some of these breakdowns in social capital. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think maybe you're sort of saying that that's a result of the choices that we've made as a society, and we've kind of moved away from these things. And they're saying, we can indeed use policy levers to kind of roll backwards on some of these things. Do you think that that's a fair way to describe this rift? Or maybe I'll broaden it out a bit and say, maybe you can highlight some ways in which you see some of the fault lines changing sort of within the broad center-right wonkosphere.
So I guess to start with the Reformicons, I think there was a lot of overlap between some of the folks who were identified, I think, as reform conservatives and some of the folks who are now viewed as being national conservatives, for instance, or pronatalists, which those two groups are different but overlapping as well. The Reformicons, I think, were less united in retrospect than maybe was apparent at the time. I think it was a group of conservatives who felt like conservatism needed to be updated so that it was more attentive to the middle class and the working class and the poor. But maybe beyond that general sense, there were a lot of disagreements underneath, partly in terms of, how the economy was serving the middle class and working class and poor. There were topics that I think Reformicons steered pretty far away from because they recognized there were a diversity of views on things like immigration, for instance. So in some ways, it was a fragile coalition, I think. The members of that coalition that have really become ascendant, as you say, are kind of now identified as being national conservatives. And yeah, I think what unites them with the sort of pronatalist social conservatives is this sense that the economy has failed a bunch of people, partly because there are a lot of social trends that they don't like. Not exclusively social. Certainly you hear Orrin Cast, talk a lot about economics and how elites have pursued misguided policies like trade, and I think that's totally off base. But he is making an argument about economics. But they're misattributing most of what they're frustrated with as being the fault of bad economic policy. When, as you say, I would sort of argue that most of it involves trade-offs that we've made, or just trends that don't have anything to do with economics, or that aren't primarily rooted in economics. Things like the deaths of despair epidemic, for instance, which has really become a thing during the period where men's pay has finally started rising again. So, the period where men were doing poorly were the 1970s and 1980s, to some extent the early 1990s. But men's pay rose a lot later in the 90s and has risen almost as fast as women's pay since then. And that's the period when you see the deaths of despair crisis, which to me, is much more readily interpretable as a crisis of opioids. Just this much more addictive drug that some people are taking, whereas in the past they would have taken drugs that weren't so addictive. But to the national conservatives, this is a problem of our economic system, and so we need to bring back manufacturing. It's sort of it's just a very strange linkage of cause and effect, I think, that doesn't line up with what the data says.
I feel like we hear that a lot, bring back manufacturing. Even I try to remind people, manufacturing output is, as high now or higher maybe than it's ever been. It's just the employment is lower because you've had so much productivity growth and capital investment. And so, I hear that often. And I kind of think that's a little bit of a red herring, but I think that's helpful to kind of illuminate some of this stuff. Cause I sympathize in the sense that I read, some of the stuff from these more national conservatives, and I kind of view some of the same problems that they're hitting on. I recognize them perhaps, as problems. So I have a lot of, I think there's something there. I just, then, when they kind of start funneling into solutions that are more about economics and clamping down on free trade and some of the other things, I have a little more trouble in seeing how that solution is supposed to be linked to the problem they're identifying. So many of these problems, I'm hesitant to say that they're even really within the bounds of what policy can really hit on, in a tangible way. So I think, maybe not doing something is better than doing something that's going to be harmful. And so I don't know. That's kind of where I come down on that question, even though, granted, that's not popular. It's not really popular to say, like, well, as a politician, we can't really do that much. So I don't know. Maybe we can figure out a way to make the, let's not do things that aren't going to solve the problem sound a little sexier or something. I don't know how that. I feel like that's kind of what has been a challenge with some of this stuff, and a really big reason why at Archbridge we're focused on in the independent sector and some of these more local groups and trying to diversify the economy and that kind of thing. Well, Gonzalo, I feel like I've shut you out here a little bit. So if you want to chime in, or if you had a question, feel free. Otherwise, I've got plenty to ask Scott about. Even digging in a little deeper on some of the things that we've discussed already.
Yeah, no, but just maybe to focus a little bit more on the social capital question, or just on why it hasn't. Maybe why it hasn't been slowing down, or what are some of the issues there. Remember, we discussed in the past, or heard you, Scott, mention a lot of times in terms of that our problem is that maybe now that we're too affluent, or that we have too many resources in order to so that we can sort of do some things ourselves, and we're not dependent so much on the community or the neighbors to babysit or things like that. So some of these issues, I think, are what you call first world problems. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on some of that. What do you mean by some of these issues being first world problems, and how does that affect social capital or any other areas?
Yeah, right. So I think I've said that before, and I may or may not be writing a book with that title.
I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. That's a good term. It could be a good book title. I'm not going to elaborate on that.
You can use it, of course, like pejoratively, and be like, oh, what are we rich Americans complaining about? Our lives are better than 99% of humanity has ever experienced, which is true. I like to use the phrase more as a way of getting at the fact that, affluent nations do have distinctive problems that are related to their affluence. And I think a lot of the decline in social capital falls into that category. As you said, Gonzalo, when we're richer, we don't have to rely on our neighbors to help us raise a barn. If we are doing home repairs or something, like, we contract out with people to do that. We rely on paid childcare instead of tapping a neighbor or needing to live near our parents so that they can provide childcare. There are all kinds of ways that we can mitigate against various risks rather than having to be nice to our neighbors or attend church every Sunday so that the church can help us in down times. We have commercial insurance, and we have credit cards, and there are all sorts of ways that we can mitigate against financial risk and other kinds of risk. Where we have the luxury of navel gazing, in a way that humanity for thousands of years, never had that luxury. It was about kind of figuring out what your next meal was going to be and where you were going to get it. Now we have a lot of time to think about our identities and who our true selves are and how we can actualize that. We can focus on, sort of the whole menu of options out there that can increase our pleasure rather than being expected to get married very young and to have 5 or 6 kids. So I think these are all very distinctive problems of affluent countries that no longer have to worry about basic necessities. And they're real problems. I mean, the fact that we have so many families experience a time crunch, where they have 2 workers and feel like they're not spending enough time with their kids and juggling too many things. Like, those are real problems, but they are problems that we've created for ourselves because so many of us choose to send 2 workers into the workplace now. They also create problems, of course, for people who would prefer not to send 2 workers into the workplace, but in order to have a bigger home, 2 cars or whatever, as the price of some of those things gets bid up. Some people who don't have the opportunity to have that more traditional lifestyle as well. These are all unique problems of rich countries, and so talking about them in terms of first world problems is an interesting way to think about it, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating way to look at it.
You're just trying to get a free copy of the book, Gonzalo, I feel like.
I'm doing my best.
He's aiming for it.
I'm aiming for it.
I would even add maybe one more on there. I've been, kind of following on this thing that certain people have dubbed like the meaning crisis. I'm growing more convinced that it's a real thing. And that, we have a colleague who works on psychology, and he's talked a lot about meaning and sort of how meaning sort of affects our economic lives as well. And I think there's really something there. But, one data point that we can point to is we're a very affluent country. And we have much higher rates of things like depression or suicide than a lot of really poor countries. They're not doing nearly as well in terms of their affluence, and yet some of those problems they've been able to sidestep. And so I don't know. I feel like it kind of in a perverse kind of way, if some of these policies get passed that limit our economic growth and our dynamism and our innovation and push our living standards down, could we see like a rise in social capital and some of the things that more tangibly people self-report as being more meaningful? I mean, I wouldn't want to do that intentionally, but I'm curious to, I don't know how that would actually work out in practice.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment. I mean, I suspect that if it did, it would probably be something that people would think was a worse trade than what we've got now, because in fact what we've chosen is to be richer and forego these things about our social life. But I do think it would be better to have more honest policy debates, that force people to kind of confront, like, well, if you would be able to have more kids if you were willing to accept, a 1970 living standard, which, if you live in a major metro area, means you're going to have to move like further out from the city, or have a smaller home. But let's make the trade-offs explicit. If we want to pursue master's degrees, to the extent that we do these days, that's going to restrict, the years during which women can bear kids, and so that's a trade-off for sure. If we wanted to get rid of the sort of time crunch that so many families face, then somebody should start working part-time and accept that income will be lower. It may not be lower than it was in 1970 or in 1980, but it will be lower than it otherwise would be. And, is that a trade-off that we're willing to accept? It's just much easier, I think, to do what the national conservatives are doing, and to point to like all the evil people responsible for all of our woes, whether it's Wall Street or free traders, or if you're sort of more in a Trumpier or populist camp, it's immigrants. People are looking for boogeymen, when really, like, we've just got to recognize the choices we've all made. And
in that sense, Scott, because I haven't really delved specifically into all of the reports from the Social Capital Project, but in it, obviously, you have all the measurements of how what social capital means or how you're measuring it. And I would think that, if we have maybe more social capital and more meaning, like you say, Ben, that we wouldn't see higher rates of depression or issues that we've seen here. But have you discussed in the project or just in general, what are your thoughts of that? Maybe that there are new ways. So there are new ways to create social capital. So we can't sort of speak about the same or expect that it will be the same. That newer ways now that communities are formed more online or around special interests or around special activities that people get together, but they're not like geographically that close to each other. I mean, I imagine there'll need to be like, let's say, adjacent counties or something, but it's not specifically on the geography. And I just say it as a silly example. Maybe I'll use my son. That obviously he's very much into Minecraft or some of his online games in which you play online with friends, and he has his close friends because we don't just let him to play with anyone. And so obviously those friends came from like people that we know. But in general, maybe some people are now going to these like online forums, either for games or for other interests, and find peers there. And at the beginning, we can't sort of trust that those people are going to be as close as like a neighbor or as a family member at first, and maybe they're farther away. But in time, those relationship also give you meaning, or the relationship will also give you some sort of social capital that can serve you even for a job. And say they can rely on them for introduction further down the line. I don't know, but has been a discussion of about sort of newer ways for social capital nowadays, or?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Whether technology has been, a net good or net bad for social capital. And I think, it's an empirical question. There hasn't been a lot of great research done yet on it, I don't think. But it all sort of comes down to, why are relationships valuable or not valuable? If people are using, email, text messaging, social media, interactive video games, if their usage of those are building or strengthening relationships, because, there's real sort of exchange of friendship and support and intimacy and vulnerability and all the things that make relationships valuable, then those are going to be more valuable for social capital. If they're things that all they do is sort of put people in connection with people in relationships where there's not that kind of exchange, and where it's more like the worst of Twitter, say, where it's putting you in touch with people who you don't really know, and it's really easy to beat up on them. And there's not going to be really any consequences for it if you do, then that's going to sort of be negatively valued social capital, I think. So a lot comes down to, how we use these new media, and ultimately, they'll be valuable or not valuable depending on what we put into them. I think there's probably, I think something like Facebook, would maybe more clearly fall on the positive side if you think of like, oh, I can now, talk to my old high school classmates who live around the country, or find, see their baby pictures and things like that. That's pretty benign. I mean, there's certainly like fights on Facebook as well, and there's fake news and all of that, but that seems more beneficial from the perspective of social capital than something like Twitter. Although, a lot of people get a ton of value from Twitter by learning things from people that they otherwise wouldn't learn, making friends that they've not actually ever met in person, but have like a real kind of give and take and with them. So I think it kind of has to end up being case by case. It's sort of a knee-jerk reaction that tech has been bad for social capital, I think is is too reactionary, I think.
Yeah, and these technologies are all still fairly new. So I suppose we'll learn more as we go, and there's probably going to be a little trial and error in all this stuff. We've gone for a little over an hour now, so I do kind of want to wrap it up a little bit. I had a few rapid fire questions, if you are up for it, Scott. I mean, if I'm oversimplifying, feel free to take as much time as you'd like to answer them. But there's just a couple that I wanted to make sure I ask before we sign off here. So, first one.
Sure.
What do you think has been the most effective anti-poverty or generally upward social mobility policy of the past 20 years?
Or maybe 30 years, because I think when you're discussing some of these policies that you go back a lot to the 1994 reform in terms of welfare. So I don't know if that's one that you think just going a little bit further back than 20.
Yeah, I think the 1990s were a really important period, both for poverty and mobility. Ryan Streeter, my colleague at AEI, has a really nice article for National Affairs about this. There was just for whatever reason, there was a lot of policy experimentation during that decade. So on the anti-poverty front, we had welfare reform, but we also had the expansion of the earned income tax credit, the creation of the child tax credit, and a bunch of other reforms that both encouraged people to work and made life better for people who were working, but who were low earners. And that combination has ended up, I think, being really good for poverty, and hopefully good for upward mobility too. We're only 25 years out, so it's still a little bit. We're kind of just getting data of, I think, some of the kids who are now full-grown adults from that. There were other policy experiments like the charter school revolution, sort of began in the 90s, which had a really interesting and important federal role. The federal government kind of provided startup funds for states who then had to agree to put in some of their own money to allow for charter schools. And then the understanding was that over time, the federal dollars were going away and the states would be on the hook for it. But that was really the policy measure that moved the needle on charter schools in places like Minnesota and other places later on. That, I think, has been, the most positive development in education policy, certainly of the last 30 years or so. So those would probably be the two that I would flag.
All right, we'll take it. The next one I wanted to ask, so what is the worst anti-poverty or social policy lever that you see floated most often?
Interesting. The worst that I see floated.
Top three, maybe?
Yeah, it could be
so
top
you don't
three.
Have to choose just one.
I mean, I do think a lot of the proposals that are aimed at reducing inequality, would not. They're not always posed as being intended to reduce poverty or to increase upward mobility, but I do think that something like a wealth tax, would be very bad policy. I think a $15 minimum wage, is a pretty bad idea. It's more than doubling the current minimum wage. There's nothing in the research that's been done on the minimum wage that can really tell us anything about the impact of doubling a minimum wage in a very, over a very small number of years.
Right. Particularly at the federal level.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. The idea that, you're going to have a $15 minimum wage in Alabama, where the cost of living is, way lower than in New York. That just seems crazy. Those two would certainly be up there. Trying to think of some other ones. I mean, Vice President Harris's proposal on the campaign trail in 2016 of, I think, giving $2,000 per child per month in perpetuity, I think was the proposal. Was like all of these proposals, the theme is like, maybe the kernel of an okay idea, that is just taken comically too far. She literally was proposing something that would have given, every family like $25,000 a year or something like that, which would just have dramatic consequences, put aside even the cost of it and how we'd pay for it. Those are a few ideas, I would say.
Okay, that sounds good.
One of the things that that sort of also worries me a little bit, and that I've heard you mention in the past, that there are that in some of the conversation to how to increase upper mobility, there are issues that are not discussed and that could be key, like economic growth or like business dynamism, in the sense that when we talk about sort of welfare plans or how to adjust some of these poverty relief systems, that's basically what they're doing. Is the function is to sort of serve as a trampoline or help people when they're in need, but that's sort of to fix poverty. But they're not addressing some of the sort of what could be, and maybe the one that you mentioned a few minutes ago about incentivizing work is one of the good parts of some of these reforms, but just work in and of itself, not seen as the main vehicle to climb the income ladder, is that what I think is key in this debate, and we don't see that that often. And what I've seen now in some of the discussions, and maybe the Kamala Harris proposal is sort of part of it, more of a focus on how we can provide more economic security and UBIs or other plans, and thinking that we need a baseline to start growing in terms of income or to get better jobs or all that, but not the jobs itself, not that aspect of job creation, the dynamism that we require. And I think we've discussed in the past how some of the stagnation maybe that we see in the numbers of mobilities coincides with the decline in business dynamism as well. And there's a few, I think, papers or places where they try to correlate and analyze the lack of business dynamism at a county level and how has that happened. I mean, how does that correlate with income mobility? I think we definitely need more of that, and we'll certainly try to do that with Archbridge. But that's the idea. If we don't have engines of job creation and more opportunities in counties at country levels, if we're comparing internationally even, I think we're missing a big part of that conversation. And we think that jobs are just going to come from somewhere, but we're not focusing that as the main driver of this conversation, which I think we should. Or as it relates, generates more economic growth, which one is, I think, heard you mention that's one of the best sort of vehicles as well for upper mobility if there is more robust economic growth. So maybe talking a little bit about that, how that's missing in this conversation as well. It's more focused on the bottom part of the poverty discussion.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think economic growth has been the primary reason why poverty has gone down over the last 50 years. And yeah, we give too short shrift often to just the importance of not getting in the way of the job creation machine that is American capitalism. I like to cite a statistic that ends up being a little bit hard to explain, but essentially the Congressional Research Service, which is sort of a think tank for Congress that does studies just for members of Congress, they put out a report on income trends or poverty trends for single mothers, I think in 2013 or something. And they found that if you looked at the poverty rate for single mothers in 2013 and you didn't count any safety net benefits at all except for unemployment, and you looked at that poverty rate, and you compared it to the poverty rate before welfare reform, so in the early 1990s, but in the early 1990s one, you include the entire cash safety net that existed at that time. Poverty was lower in 2013, even though you're not counting all of the expanded safety net that we did in between. If you hadn't had any of that, just by encouraging more people to work, you would have seen a decline in poverty, even on top of the earned income tax credit, on top of the expanded SNAP benefits that we also did, on top of more generous disability benefits, all of that. So that really speaks to the importance of growth. And that's sort of, in some ways, the bread and butter of Republican policymaking, but it's too often not done in a thoughtful way, I think. Thinking more about what specific kinds of deregulation, would encourage economic growth, what specific ways of incentivizing innovation would expand economic growth. That's something that I think conservatives need to think harder about, and would be extraordinarily valuable both for upward mobility and for poverty reduction.
Definitely something that we'll be thinking harder about, and we'll be following what you do on that as well. I think that's probably a good place to end it. So I really appreciate you taking the time and talking with us about poverty and mobility and some of the complex dynamics that are going on here. And hopefully we'll get to do this again sometime in the near future.
Yeah, that'd be great. It was a pleasure to chat with you guys. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Scott.